Hi, I'm Jasma. Let's make tang yuan, also known as glutinous rice balls. Today I'll be sharing with you 3 different flavors that are super simple to make from scratch: white sesame seed and goji berries, taro and rose, and pistachio and osmanthus. This is a sweet and chewy Chinese dessert served in a soup, meant to be eaten on the 15th day of the Lunar New Year to celebrate the Lantern Festival and family union. Starting with the pistachio filling, I have my roasted pistachios, which I'm going to ground up in my mini food processor. You can also buy pre-grounded pistachios if you want to skip this step. But if you're doing it yourself, be sure not to overmix because this will turn into a nut butter. I melted down my coconut oil and added it to the ground pistachios, along with the salt and Osmanthus sugar syrup. If you've never tasted Osmanthus flowers before, it has a fruity and floral, sort of apricot-y and peachy flavor, but it can be a little bit bitter, which is why I like to use the Osmanthus sugar syrup to introduce it, because it kind of mellows out that bitterness, and using the syrup also binds together the pistachios. You can find this in an Asian grocery store, but if you can't get your hands on these, you can use a mixture of dried Osmanthus flowers with honey or maple syrup, but just reduce the amount a little bit because those substitutes might be a bit sweeter than this. Mix together the pistachio filling, and it will look a little bit dry at first, but once the coconut oil and sugar syrup has coated all the pistachios, it will come together nicely like this. Next, I'm making the white sesame and goji berry filling. You want some roasted white sesame seeds. If you bought them raw, then make sure to toast them yourself so it's extra fragrant. Add the sesame to your food processor along with some toasted walnuts and blend until it has a sand-like texture. Transfer into a bowl and add the honey. You can also use maple syrup for sweetness. Also add the melted coconut oil and salt and give it all a very thorough mix. Now this filling is going to be a bit more crumbly compared to the pistachio, and it's not going to form a cohesive dough, but just mix until you can tell that the honey has coated everything and it looks a little something like this. I'm using goji berries in the filling as well. You would usually see this put into the soup of glutinous rice balls, but I thought that putting them in the filling kind of adds a nice pop of color. It's an interesting bite and texture. And since goji berries are dried, I'm soaking them in warm water for just a minute or two. It does not take long at all for them to soften up, and you don't want to leave it in there for too long because if they get too soft, then they're gonna get crushed really easily. You want them to stay intact so it doesn't become just a complete mess. Then for the final flavor, let's make the taro and rose filling. I have my peeled and cubed taro, which I'm pouring into a steam-safe bowl so that I can steam it on high heat for around 10 to 15 minutes. It depends on the size of your taro, but to know if it's ready, you want to just test it by poking it with a fork, and if it breaks up like this, that means it's good to go. Then as soon as you take it off the stove, you want to mash up the taro using a fork. It is a lot easier to do while it's still hot because it'll be mushy and crumbly like this. Then in goes the coconut oil, salt, and rose sugar syrup, which I'm using to introduce the rose flavor as well as sweetness. And if you can't get your hands on this, you can substitute it using dried rose petals and honey. Mix that in with the taro, and unlike all of the other fillings, this one's actually going to look a little too wet at first, but just mix it all in because the taro is going to soak up all the moisture, and as it cools down, it's going to become more like a dough. All 3 flavors of the fillings are done, so we can move on to portioning them. Now, if you don't care to be as accurate as I prefer to be when it comes to making uniform size glutinous rice balls, you can totally just eyeball this, but I like to weigh them out individually just to ensure that all of them are the same size so that I can control the amount made and also know that they'll take the same amount of time to cook. All 3 of these fillings are super easy to work with. You don't need to freeze them ahead of time or even chill it. You can just scoop and measure them straight away, and it shouldn't stick to you at all. With the filling all measured out, you want to pop them into the freezer so they can firm up, and this is going to make the wrapping a lot easier for later. And for your reference, the recipes I provided makes 12 of each flavor, with the ratio being 7 grams of filling to 10 grams of dough. These are pretty small glutinous rice balls, and in my experience, 12 would serve roughly 2 people, so I would recommend doubling or tripling the recipe if you do intend to make only 1 flavor. On to making the wrappers. What makes the glutinous rice balls chewy is the glutinous rice flour, so it's very important that this is the kind of flour that you're using. It's available in all Asian grocery stores, and you should be able to find it online as well. Now, different types of glutinous rice flour may require different amounts of liquid to form the consistency you need. I think it's easier to combine more flour into a really wet dough as opposed to trying to figure out how much more water you should add to a really dry and crumbly dough. So just start with the amount of water that I provide to you in my recipe, mix it until it is fully incorporated, and then decide if you should add more water or more flour. For the pistachio and taro glutinous rice balls, I wanted to make the exterior green and pink. I'm using matcha powder for the green one and beetroot powder for the pink one. And make sure you don't go too heavy-handed with the coloring because the color will show up a lot more vibrant after the dough is boiled. Once the dough is kneaded, make sure you cover it really tightly with plastic wrap so it doesn't begin to dry out and crack. If you do end up with dried dough, just add a little warm water to kind of reactivate it and make it malleable again. If you want to try making these yourself, be sure to grab the full written recipe from my blog, jasmafusioncuisine.com. And while we're on the topic of self-promo, I may or may not have started posting on TikTok. Feel free to go check it out if you want to see my process developing the recipes for this video. Also, here's my Instagram, Pinterest, and Patreon if you're interested. Everything is linked in the description. We're ready to assemble. Now, since the dough dries out pretty quickly, it would be less ideal to portion them out individually, so I'm just going to cut it up into 12 pieces. And each piece should weigh roughly 10 grams, which I think is a really good filling to dough ratio. Now you can take the filling out from the freezer, grab a piece of the dough and keep the rest covered while you work on each one. Then to assemble, this is my preferred technique for wrapping up any kind of filling because it creates the least amount of overlapping of dough, which is nicer when you bite into it, and also theoretically if you were to cut it in half, it also looks nicer. Be sure you seal it really tightly and then place it onto a plate lined with plastic wrap. This is important. The dough doesn't feel sticky, but it will stick to your plate once it settles down. So either sprinkle on some glutinous rice flour or line it with plastic wrap. At this point, if there are any glutinous rice balls that you don't intend on cooking straight away, you should freeze. I love stocking up my freezer and saving them for later because they last for a really long time. And I prefer doing this immediately because if they sit out for too long and start to dry, you'll risk getting these little cracks. Now for the glutinous rice balls you do want to cook, prepare a large pot of boiling water, lower the glutinous rice balls in, give it a stir, and wait for the water to come back to a rolling boil. Pour in some cold water to reduce the temperature of the pot. This way the glutinous rice balls cook more gently and they avoid breaking. You'll know it's cooked when the water comes back to a boil and everything floats to the top. This dessert is served with a soup, which you can add some mix-ins to spice up the flavors. I kept it plain, but I did sprinkle in some dried rose petals just for an extra pop of color. Be sure to check out my other glutinous rice ball video if you want to learn how to make the most traditional flavor of tang yuan. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.